Okay, so here we are in Learning Objective 9.8. So what I want to do here is I want to talk about how we relate leadership to decision making and discuss both the rational and behavioral perspectives on decision making. So here I want to talk about the nature of decision making. Decision making itself is the act of choosing one alternative from among a set of alternatives. There are different types of decisions. Managers make many different types of decisions. In general, however, most decisions fall into one or two categories. They are either non-programmed or non-programmed decisions. A programmed decision is one that is relatively structured or occurs with some frequency or both. Non-programmed decisions, on the other hand, are relatively unstructured and occur much less often. Decision-making conditions is what I want to talk about next. Just as there are different kinds of decisions, there are also different conditions in which decisions must be made. The state of certainty, that is when the decision maker knows what reasonable certainty. All right. State of certainty is when the decision maker knows with reasonable certainty what the alternatives are and what conditions are associated with each alternative. So there's a state of risk, and that is when the availability of each alternative and its potential payoffs and costs are all associated with probability estimates. So we have the state of risk and we have the state of uncertainty. Uncertainty is when the decision maker does not know all of the alternatives, and the risks associated with each are the likely consequences of each alternative, puts us into uncertainty. So think about that for a minute. Whenever there's more uncertainty, there's more risk. And that's when the rubber meets the road. So you have to make a decision. So you have to take the risk. The less you know, the less information that you have, the less certainty that you have, the less rationale there is behind it on your outcome. But what if you're left with a little choice? What do you do? This is when true leadership comes through. So now let's gear ourselves toward rational decision making. There are a number of steps in the rational decision making process. The first is recognizing and defining the decision situation. The second is identifying alternatives. The third is evaluating alternatives. And finally, selecting the best alternative, implementing that alternative, and following up and evaluating the results. So, first thing we want to do is if we got a problem, we recognize the problem. And you need some type of stimulus to initiate the process. Do some brainstorming. Talk about a lot of factors that are related with one another of how to solve the problem. Then once you do all your brainstorming, you come up with a bunch of alternatives and how to solve the problem. But as leaders, you listen to everybody's opinion. So you want to put those alternative courses of effective action into play, but you have to really look at how much are we deviating from what we normally do and how much innovation is involved in solving the problem. Then you evaluate everything. You weigh the pros and cons of every alternative that you come up with. Then finally, you choose the best one. And you give a time value line. You give estimates on how long you think it's going to take to solve the problem. Finding multiple acceptable alternatives can be possible, but selecting just one and rejecting all the others might not be necessary. You may have more than one way of solving a problem, but you narrow it down the best way you can to one or two solutions. Then you implement the best chosen alternative. Sometimes implementation is fairly easy, but often it is difficult to exactly know what the potential outcome will be, depending on the amount of risk. Then you follow up and evaluate the results. Did it work? Did it not work? If it didn't work, why? Now, some of the other thing, the last thing I want to talk about is the behavioral aspects of decision making. So while approaching decision situations logically is the most ideal way to do it, but frequently decisions, as I mentioned earlier, are made with little regard for logic, but still can turn out to be correct. Sometimes you go on your instinct and your gut feeling. It depends on the content and what is going on at the time. So there are several ingredients in how these forces work and their behavioral in nature are making the decision. So there's political forces, and that is political forces contribute to the behavioral nature of decision making, and you form a coalition. It's like an informal alliance of individuals or groups formed to achieve a common goal. Then there's intuition. Intuition is an innate belief about something, often without conscious consideration. Intuition is often, though, like a hunch. While it's not as arbitrary as it sounds, it is actually based on experience and practice of the leader in the decision making process. Then you have escalation of commitment. Escalation of commitment occurs when managers become so committed to the course of action they have chosen that they stay with it, even when it appears to be wrong. And this separates the leader, the good leader, from the not so good leader. When you know something's wrong, you're going to own up, fess up, take responsibility. And then there is what they call a risk propensity in decision making. Risk propensity is the extent to which the decision maker is willing to gamble when making a decision. Conservative managers are cautious and less likely to avoid mistakes or big losses. More aggressive managers may achieve big successes, but are also more likely to incur greater losses. And you really have to think about that for a bit. You don't want to take a loss unless you really have to. So remember, leaders often engage in rational decision making that occurs when a manager makes a decision by selecting and implementing a best alternative. A coalition, on the other hand, is an informal alliance of individuals or groups formed to achieve a common goal. And often that goal is a preferred decision alternative. Remember that a hunch is intuition, which is an innate belief about something, often without conscious consideration. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And the final point is that every individual has a varying level of risk propensity. That is the extent to which a person is willing to gamble when making a decision. So some of the things here to reflect upon is what are some typical constraints that can limit the identification of alternatives. If an alternative appears not to be working, what are the manager's options? And then, for what types of decisions would the rational decision-making model apply, and why? Now, finally, when you have an escalation of commitment, as we remember, it involves selecting a course of action and then becoming so committed to it that managers stay with it, even when it appears to be wrong. So, why do some managers stay with a course of action even when they know it to be wrong? Is this egotistical or is it self efficacy? I want you to think about that. That is the end of this lecture, and I want you to do a reflection on everything we've talked about today and throughout the week, and spend about 15 minutes on that. Have a good weekend, Professor D.